Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Gonna kick it right on over to Drew Coleman, but here in just a minute for some opening remarks. But like I said, had a note for you all in the waiting room. If any questions come up throughout the presentations this morning, go ahead and direct them to me in the chat, and I will field them right along. We do have quite a bit of questions already set up and teed up, but any questions that go unanswered, we'll be sure to follow up with you and get them answered during the course of the meeting today, if possible. Thank you.
And who are you, Kyle? So they don't know, in case they don't know.
Thank you so much, Drew. I'm Kyle McAdam. I'm our Government Affairs Coordinator here at the Oregon Realtors.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. It's not a terribly rainy Portland day where I am, and hopefully you're experiencing some nice weather where you are as well. But this is a very important topic for us. As realtors, we strive to go above and beyond for our clients, and we want to consistently show up for our community in meaningful ways in times of need. So collectively, realtors may get up every day to pursue our calling of finding the ideal home for a particular client, or to do everything we can to provide exceptional experience to them, to those sellers who entrusted us with their home. But I think it's safe to say you all are here today because you understand realtors can and should play a role in positively impacting our local communities in enduring ways. So our state as a whole, and I'm sure you're experiencing this wherever you are, is in serious need of more housing. I know that the shortage where I am is pretty extreme, and experts have said that we are facing a projected supply shortage of over 550,000 units, and we'll need to build at least that many over the next 20 years to accommodate future population growth here in our great state. So as more and more people relocate to Oregon in the coming years, and as current Oregonians move, downsize, or search for the perfect home to age in place or start a family, our industry will continue to play a special, and I'd say pivotal role in helping folks make the right decision at the right time. However, I also believe we have a responsibility to look beyond the next transaction or what we're working on today. We should always be on the lookout for opportunities to help shape the future of our local communities, particularly when it comes to lending our expertise to efforts to address our severe housing shortfall. So here's the good news. Fortunately, conversations about how to accelerate the development of more types of housing are underway across the state. From Central Oregon to the I-5 corridor and then cities up and down the coast, Oregon Realtors and our partners can be found contributing to these conversations as they serve on volunteer boards, commissions, even in elected office, as we have some of our members doing. These colleagues and peers are hard at work in their local communities, partnering with dedicated public servants in city planning and community development to bring about the changes necessary to prepare for the future. Our guests today are here to provide us with the context and local lens that we need to understand much better one of the most important, substantial ongoing discussions in our state and to highlight ways that realtors can get involved. So let's start with a little context. In 2019, the Oregon legislature passed bipartisan bills that Oregon Realtors supported, House Bills 2001 and 2003. And those were aimed at breaking down barriers to development in growing communities across Oregon. And our first guest will start us off by providing an overview of those bills and the current status of implementation from the perspective of our statewide planning agency, the Department of Land, Conservation and Development, or DLCD. So let me, without further ado, introduce Sean Edging. Sean is a housing policy analyst with the DLCD. Lately, Sean's been spearheading a virtual tour of the state, hosting conversations with local government planning staff and communities of all sizes along the way, gathering feedback, engaging the readiness of local cities to comply with requirements set forth in those House Bills 2001 and 2003. Before joining the agency, Sean received his master's in urban and regional planning from Portland State and worked in the private sector on both current and long-range planning issues before joining the agency. Thank you so much, Sean, for joining us today to set the stage for our discussion. Why don't you take it away for us?
Excellent. Thank you, Drew. And I really appreciate that introduction. That was very, very kind. And just want to thank you all for inviting me here today to kind of talk about House Bills 2001 and 2003 with you all. I think it's always a very special day when realtors invite bureaucrats to come and provide presentations to them. And I think that's not lost on me. So I'm going to do my best to try to not get so lost in the technical jargon today, and instead, kind of impart some understanding about how these bills are actually going to function. So with that, let me share my screen really quickly and just get the PowerPoint that I have prepared for you all today. All right, are you folks able to see that? Just a kind of full screen presentation right in front of you? Okay, great. Excellent. Great, yeah, so the whole point of kind of this initial presentation is really to provide kind of this high level overview of these two bills and kind of some of the key pieces of how they're going to function. Now, I do want to kind of preface before I get into this, you know, these bills, of course, they have a lot of inner workings and pieces that go into them that I can't really cover in the time that we have here today. Really, my goal is to just kind of impart a high level understanding of what these bills do and what are kind of some of the key functionalities of them. And so I recognize that there might be a lot of questions folks have, and I really want to invite you, you know, for the sake of time and given the size of the audience, I can't address them during the presentation, but towards the end, you know, especially if you have questions that you could provide to Kyle through the chat, I'd be happy to answer those towards the end because I recognize I'm going to be missing a lot as I go through this presentation. All right, so to dive into this, kind of as Drew mentioned, you know, in 2019, the Oregon legislature passed these two bills, House Bills 2001 and 2003, that are really aimed at kind of, you know, improving the housing landscape that we have here today. House Bill 2001 is one that we like to kind of deem housing or call housing choice because it re-legalizes a lot of options that give people more choice in terms of the housings that they can consume or live in. And then House Bill 2003, we like to refer to it as housing needs and production. And it's really trying to get at how do we actually plan for the future and how do we ensure that we plan to provide enough housing as we move forward. So I'm going to kind of dive into a little bit of each of these bills. I'll start with House Bill 2001 and just kind of provide a general overview. I'm sure a lot of you folks have already heard of House Bill 2001. It's made a lot of very sensational headlines in the past. Really what House Bill 2001 is all about is about re-legalizing what's been called the missing middle form of housing. These are housing types that have been, you know, it may be in the past traditionally legal, but were kind of outlawed with the advent of kind of single family exclusionary zoning. And these include housing types like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, cottage clusters, all of these housing types that are kind of smaller and use more shared resources, but have kind of been not built in our kind of current landscape and are kind of missing today. And so to speak a little bit to what these requirements are, what House Bill 2001 does is it kind of requires local jurisdictions to go through their single family zones and re-legalize these middle housing types. And there's two very kind of large key requirements that go with each one of these, and they apply to cities of different sizes. So let's start with the requirement for medium-sized cities because this one's pretty simple. So for medium cities, these are defined as, you know, cities between kind of 10,000 and 25,000 in population outside of the Portland metro, so kind of smaller cities, things like that. They are required essentially to re-legalize or allow for the development of duplexes on any lot or parcel that allows for the development of a detached single family dwelling. So you could think, you know, in any particular neighborhood where all of these single family detached homes are allowed, there's now kind of this ability for folks to build a duplex or convert their home to a duplex on those lots or parcels. And for large cities, there's this kind of additional requirement on top of that. So large cities are defined as cities that are above 25,000 in population outside of the metro. So these are kind of some of the bigger players in kind of the state, as well as kind of the Portland metro. So cities inside the Portland metro, as well as kind of unincorporated urban areas. Those kind of areas, say, for example, in the South Metro that might not be within a particular city or might not be incorporated, but essentially function as a city. And what their requirement is in addition to this duplex requiring a duplex, essentially allowing a duplex on each lot or parcel, they have this requirement to allow other middle housing types, what we call higher middle housing types. These include triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. And what that requirement specifically is they have to allow these housing types in areas that allow for the development of a detached single family dwelling. And of course, I'm sure some of you folks might have keyed into the vagueness of that language, the concept of in areas. And this was a big question that we had in rulemaking. How do we take this vague term and operationalize it into something that's more concrete and gives us an idea of how this will actually play out on the ground? And so I'm going to start diving into what we did as an agency in response to this bill. So this bill kind of sets this overarching policy concept, and really it comes down to our job to, through what we call rulemaking, to define the parameters around how this bill is actually implemented. And so really what our job has been to think through is how do we, allow for all of these middle housing types to be developed while providing this kind of flexibility that's built within the bill. So they have this provision on in areas, they allow local jurisdictions to regulate the siting and design of middle housing. And our question is to really define what that means in the context of how far can you do that before essentially you're preventing these middle housing types from being built at all. And so I'm gonna dive a little bit into that. So there's kind of two functions that I have to talk about here. One is the model code, and I think I have these slides backwards, so I apologize for that. And then the other one is the minimum compliance. So the model code, to speak to that more directly, this is a requirement in House Bill 2001 for our agency to develop. It's this kind of set of standards that can be applied statewide that allow for the development of middle housing, and it can be implemented directly in any city. Like you could just take this code and you could just apply it without any further interpretation or question. And the purpose of this model code is kind of twofold. On the one hand, it's intended to kind of provide a set of best practices for how you regulate and implement middle housing inside cities. And then on the other hand, it's a regulatory tool. So the bill requires cities to update their zoning codes to allow these middle housing types by certain dates. And if they don't meet that date, this model code applies directly. So it's kind of twofold. It's got that best practice piece, but also if a jurisdiction doesn't comply, it is the regulatory function for allowing middle housing in these areas, even if a jurisdiction doesn't act. And so let's talk a little bit about the model code. There's kind of two primary versions of it. There's one that applies to medium cities, as I mentioned before, and this one's all focused on duplexes, that concept of operationalizing duplexes on each lot or parcel. And then additionally, we're kind of preparing another model code for the larger cities. And this includes not only the duplex piece, but also all of the higher middle housing types, the tris and quadplexes, the cottage clusters, the townhouses, and it designs a set of standards that can be implemented in any particular single family zone. And so, I kind of mentioned this piece on applying directly and how it's kind of a regulatory tool for cities that don't comply. Now, for the cities that do develop their own codes, there's this kind of additional flexibility. They can move away from the model code. And how do we approach that in terms of what are the parameters on how they can actually regulate middle housing? And that's where this second piece comes in, and it's what we call the minimum compliance standards. These are embedded in Oregon administrative rule, which functionally have kind of the function of law. And what it's designed to do is provide a little bit of additional flexibility from the model code in terms of how you can actually regulate these middle housing types. So it kind of sets parameters. And really the intent of this section is to say to cities, all right, if you're going to develop your own codes, that's great. Here are kind of some of the parameters that you need to live within to ensure that you're actually complying with both the letter and the intent of the bill. And so let's move into kind of some of the key functions of this piece. So you remember earlier how I kind of mentioned there's this vague term in areas that apply to these higher middle housing types, which is very difficult. It could be anywhere between one lot in a city to 99% of lots in a city, and anything in between that could be functionally in areas. So we had this very challenging task of trying to think through what does this actually mean in context of middle housing. For duplexes, it's very simple. On each lot or parcel, that has been a very useful operationalization, a useful framework for implementation. But for in areas, we have to think through, all right, where should these middle housing types be allowed and where should they not, and where should that kind of flexibility live? And so for starters, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the kind of rationalizations behind each of these decisions. I'm just going to kind of explain what they are. For these higher middle housing types, where we start is kind of this idea that all single family zones should be eligible to allow middle housing. And from there, we're going to take away lands that don't really make sense to allow these kind of higher middle housing types. And so where we start obviously is with kind of our goal protected lands, these lands that are, say, next to riparian corridors, lands that are subject to natural hazards, that kind of thing. And it's not so much that we don't allow middle housing in these areas, it's more that we regulate them a little bit differently in light of that kind of goal protection. A good example is historic districts, Goal 5 historic districts. We didn't want to preclude any opportunity for middle housing in these neighborhoods, but we also recognize that there's kind of a reasonable need to regulate these lands. So it's not so much that we're excluding middle housing from these areas, so much as they are regulated differently in these goal protected areas. Additionally, there's this kind of piece on infrastructure constrained land. So you could think, say, you probably shouldn't build a fourplex in an area where the only thing you can have is septic or well water, that kind of thing. And so we have some parameters around that. Additionally, there's this piece on master plan communities. So we've developed rules that really function well inside an urban growth boundary, inside where we kind of currently have development, where single family homes exist. But how do we approach greenfields where you can kind of plan out the infrastructure in advance, you can plan out the housing type and mix well in advance, and how do you really approach those areas? So we kind of have some provisions around that. And then finally, this one's kind of was new to me, is there's a lot of lands that are under kind of state and federal regulatory regimes that make it very difficult to build middle housing, or impossible legally. One of the best examples that came to my mind was the Federal Aviation Administration and having certain limitations on areas that are close to airports. And so all of these are kind of considered beforehand. Now, once you do that initial consideration, there's two tracks that you can go down when you come to defining in areas. One is what we call the minimum compliance route. What this does is it functionally says, all right, all of these eligible lots, they can functionally allow middle housing types, but you can have certain regulations to limit, say, the minimum lot size of these different middle housing types. So it doesn't end up being everywhere, but instead ends up being on kind of this wide swath of lands. And I won't dive into the details on that because that'll take a lot of time. Alternatively, there's this kind of performance metric track, which is to say, all right, well, you can set these different minimum lot sizes and maximum densities, provided that you can demonstrate that these middle housing types are functionally allowed on a percentage of these lots. And where these percentages are is 80% of lots for triplexes, 70% for quadplexes, 60% for townhomes, and then 70% for cottage clusters. And then you also have to kind of demonstrate that you're achieving an equitable distribution. So you're not just keeping this out of your exclusive neighborhoods and then putting it all in, say, one pocket of the city. All right, moving on to kind of citing a design, there's this question around, all right, well, we might allow a triplex or a quadplex, but they have to provide an unreasonable number of parking spaces, for example. And then functionally, you're not going to have any plexes that are really built because they have to overcome this incredible obstacle in citing a design. So we had to think through, where are those parameters? Where are those kind of lines where jurisdictions can regulate citing a design before they go too far and actually just prevent plexes or these middle housing types from happening altogether. And so we had these conversations around all of these kind of typical development standards, setbacks, minimum lot size, all of these pieces. And we kind of thought through, how do we develop a set of reasonable standards that can be applied to middle housing to set that kind of ceiling for where you can regulate citing a design. And really a lot of this is based on how jurisdictions currently regulate their single family detached dwellings. And we've kind of structured it to make sure that it's not more restrictive than what applies to single family detached dwellings. Of course, we've had to kind of think through some very special considerations. I think one of the biggest ones was off-street parking, because we know that can pose a very severe barrier to middle housing. But for the most part, if you look through the divisions, it really relates back to the single family detached zone, or the single family detached dwelling standards. All right, and there's finally this small piece that's a small asterisk to House Bill 2001. It's called the Infrastructure-Based Time Extension Request. During these kind of conversations for House Bill 2001, one of the biggest concerns that came up was this idea that we have a lot of areas that aren't sufficiently served with infrastructure, and realistically, we can't allow these middle housing types in these areas because they won't be served. And the way the legislature provided a remedy for that is to say, all right, well, if you can demonstrate that you have these infrastructure constrained areas or infrastructure deficient areas, you can apply for an extension of time to give you the time to plan out the infrastructure for these areas and allow middle housing at a point in the future. So we've kind of developed this process to outline what the parameters are in that, and those rules are effective today. All right, so that is the very high level overview of House Bill 2001, and I'm going to start moving into talking about House Bill 2003. So, you know, House Bill 2001 has kind of received all of the headlines. It's been this, you know, middle housing provision, and it's received a lot of kind of media attention, whereas House Bill 2003 has kind of flown under the radar. Though, you know, us here at the agency, we actually feel that House Bill 2003 is going to have one of the most lasting impacts on our kind of housing planning landscape today. And really what this bill is all about is thinking about how jurisdictions plan for housing. So today, the way jurisdictions plan for housing is through what we call Goal 10, or kind of our statewide housing planning goal. And the whole intent of this bill is to make that goal work better. So we have these kind of existing requirements. The whole point of this bill is to build on those existing requirements to better plan for and accommodate housing over time. And it really consists of three primary components. The first one is a regional housing needs analysis. I'll talk about this one first. It's this kind of pilot or test methodology that really tries to get at estimating the total statewide housing need. Actually, you might have heard that number, 550,000. That actually comes from this analysis. And then there's two other components that are requirements for local cities. One is a housing needs analysis update schedule. I'll talk about what a housing needs analysis is in a second for those who aren't familiar. And then secondly, there's this housing production strategy, which builds on this kind of housing needs analysis requirement that already exists. And again, I'll talk about both of these in a second. But let's start with the regional housing needs analysis. So the whole point of this is to, you know, the legislature was kind of curious about this system that California employs, where the state functionally estimates housing need at the statewide level and provides that to different regions to kind of facilitate housing planning in those areas. And what the legislature was interested in was thinking, could something like this, or some modified version of this, be incorporated into Oregon's statewide housing planning system, and how would that work? And so what it did is it tasked two agencies. It tasked OHCS, Oregon Housing and Community Services, and our agency to do kind of different components of this work. OHCS was tasked with developing this kind of test or pilot methodology to estimate housing needs statewide. And they've done this, that, you know, their deadline was September 1st. They've published this very lengthy or very complete technical document on their website that really goes into all of the bits and pieces of the methodology, the results, and it actually provides tables for each individual city. OHCS has to take this analysis and they have to kind of prepare this summary report to the legislature by March 1st of 2021. Now, what our agency, DLCD, was tasked with doing was taking a look at this methodology and thinking, all right, how could this fit in with how we do housing planning today, how we do Goal 10 housing planning, to think through, you know, if we move forward with something like a regional housing needs analysis, how would this actually be implemented today? And so what we are tasked with doing is developing this kind of evaluation report to submit to the legislature by March 1st of 2021. So there's going to be two reports, one from OHCS, one from DLCD, both on the regional housing needs analysis, but answering slightly different questions. And then in 2021, the legislature will take this information and think through, what do we actually want to do about this in terms of, you know, do we move forward with AREA? Do we move forward with something else? Do we, you know, what should we do in light of this kind of pilot analysis? And so I could spend an hour talking about, you know, just all of the small pieces of the methodology, all of these kind of nuances of how the regional housing needs analysis works, and we don't have time for that today. So I really am just going to focus on kind of some of the broad results. But before we dive into that, I do want to mention, you know, the key pieces of this methodology are estimating housing need over 20 years. So estimating, say, people who are going to be moving in and households forming. Another part is estimating underproduction, which is the housing units that we should have built, but we have not, which has resulted in housing shortage over time and rising costs, as you guys are all familiar with. And then the third piece is estimating housing for people who are experiencing homelessness, because this is something that has been traditionally overlooked in our housing planning system. Now, to dive into the results, what you see in front of you is kind of these relative pie charts. In gray here, you have this kind of our existing housing stock based on 2018 data. And then in yellow is the amount of housing that we're going to need to add by 2040 to accommodate the estimates that we have in the regional housing needs analysis over time. And so when you kind of break this down for each one of the regions that were selected in the regional housing needs analysis, it paints a pretty stark picture. So, here are the three components that I kind of mentioned earlier. So there's projected need or growth over time, underproduction, what we should have today, and then housing for the homelessness or housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. When you add all three of those components together at a statewide level, you get a pretty stark picture, right? And 550,000 is actually a little bit low. It's actually closer to 584,000 units over the next 20 years to accommodate the full picture, the full gamut of everything that we've kind of identified as being needed in our housing market. And of course, this is a very lofty goal, we recognize, but I think it has a lot of implications for thinking through how we plan for housing. Now, if we start thinking about a housing need kind of distributed in this need, when you look at folks with higher income, say 120% or greater median family income, a lot of this is going to be growth over time. So, households moving in, people moving in, that kind of thing. And, as you move down in income brackets, you'll notice more and more of this becomes the result of underproduction. And then at the bottom, housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. And this is pretty important because these two factors, underproduction and housing for people who are experiencing homelessness, haven't really been accounted for in today's how we plan for housing today. So this need right here isn't identified really in any housing needs analysis that we have today. And so it really paints a much stronger or broader picture for housing that is affordable to people at lower incomes. And when you translate this into kind of the different income brackets statewide, it's pretty stark. Over the next 20 years, roughly 30% of the housing units that are identified in the regional housing needs analysis are going to require some type of public support because these housing types don't get built just by the market alone. They typically require some form of public subsidy, either to the builder or to the inhabitant of the unit. And then an additional 17%, this kind of 50 to 80%, this is kind of like workforce housing or people who, might be working, say, kind of middle wage jobs. And, oftentimes this doesn't get built without some type of public subsidy. So an additional 17% could require some form of public support to actually be built in the future. And so what we're thinking about when we take these vast numbers is we're trying to think through how can we take this regional housing needs analysis and fit this in with our existing Goal 10 framework? Because right now, jurisdictions, they plan for their own housing need over time and they plan to accommodate that. And how could a system like this incorporate into our kind of current planning system? How could this kind of take some of the places that we have built into this framework? And ultimately, what we're going to be thinking about in our report to the legislature is if you move forward with something like this, what recommendations can we offer you to kind of best achieve affordable, fair, and equitable housing options, which is kind of the legislative goal behind this whole thing in the first place. And then if it's not moved forward with, what recommendations can we offer anyways on our kind of existing housing planning system to achieve those same outcomes in lieu of ARENA? So that's kind of the regional housing needs analysis. I'm going to move over. You'll notice I shift colors here to distinguish the two to the housing needs analysis schedule. And so for those who aren't familiar, under Goal 10 today, local jurisdictions have an obligation to plan for housing. More specifically, they have an obligation to inventory their existing housing supply and then estimate over the next 20 years how many housing units they're going to need to accommodate their growing population. And that's all encompassed within this housing needs analysis. So it looks at a projection of housing units, and then they start thinking about how are we actually going to build these units. What House Bill 2003 does is it requires cities above 10,000 to start regularly updating this housing needs analysis. Previously, it was just kind of done at the local jurisdiction's volition, typically when they wanted to expand their urban growth boundary. And now there's this schedule that cities have to follow. It's if you're within the metro, it's once every 6 years, and if you're outside of the metro, it's once every 8 years. And we've kind of developed and adopted this schedule that cities are going to have to regularly update their housing needs analysis by. So let's move to housing production strategies. This builds off of the kind of existing housing needs analysis. So as I've kind of talked about it, a housing needs analysis is projecting your future household growth and thinking through, all right, how are we going to zone lands or expand outward to ensure that we have enough buildable land to accommodate the amount of housing that we're going to have over the next 20 years. And what the housing production strategy is all about, it's a requirement that goes further than the H&A. So an H&A is all about accommodating need, identifying and accommodating need, whereas the housing production strategy is moving forward into addressing need, or actually putting forward policies that make it more likely that housing will actually be built on the lands that you've identified to accommodate them. And so the whole point of this document is to identify a list of strategies in the city, or specific actions, including the adoption of measures and policies that the city shall undertake to promote development within the city to address a housing need that's identified. And so we've been given the task of operationalizing this concept. How do we get cities to implement strategies that really go farther than their H&A and actually promote the development of housing inside their cities? And so I always like to present things in graphical formats. This kind of shows the schedule for the housing needs analysis and housing production strategy in broad terms. And it really starts with the housing needs analysis. So now, as you remember, there's this kind of schedule that they all have to follow. And the housing production strategy has to follow that. Specifically, within 1 year of the deadline for a housing needs analysis, a city must complete a housing production strategy. And there's kind of some key components to that. There's a contextualization of housing need. There's an engagement component. There's the actual strategies to meet future housing need. And then there's this kind of section on achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes, which is really something cities have not done before. And so let's talk about kind of each one of these pieces of the HPS, the contextualization, engagement, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm also going to talk just a little bit about the kind of administrative side of it. So how often do they have to do this reporting? How often do they have to kind of check in? And then what are the tools for enforcement to actually make sure jurisdictions are complying with this program? So to start with the contextualization of housing need, if you were to take a look at any given housing needs analysis today, it's a very bureaucratic process. You take this kind of population projection from Portland State University and you say, all right, let's take this and translate it into a 20-year housing projection over time. Let's translate this into households over the next 20 years. And that's a pretty, that's a not very nuanced take, right? You end up with this number essentially that kind of, provides a rough estimate of just total households, but it doesn't get into a lot of the nuance that we know exists in planning for housing. Specifically, we know that a lot of people are facing, rent burden. We know that there's a lot of differences in tenure of housing. We know that there are disparities by race and ethnicity. We know that people experiencing homelessness hasn't really been addressed, and then of course there's housing for people with disabilities, and then also state and federal protected classes. So the whole point of this section is to say, all right, take your housing needs analysis and start considering all of these additional factors that kind of really impact people's abilities to access housing over time. This next piece is engagement. And this is, we understand that data can get us so far in identifying our housing need, but it can only, there's limitations to it. There's limitations to how far data can get you a picture of what's really happening on the ground. So we recognize that it was really necessary for jurisdictions to be engaging in conversations with people inside their cities to think through what strategies we actually need to implement. And so we have kind of two main requirements. One is for consumers of needed housing, and one is for producers of needed housing. And this is really, the intent of this is to get cities to start listening to the people who consume and produce housing, to start thinking through what strategies they should actually start thinking about adopting and implementing. And now strategies to meet future housing need. This was by far the most work-intensive part of this. This is all about selecting the different strategies a city is going to move forward with to promote the development of housing. What we've done as part of rulemaking is worked with a lot of folks to identify this very long list of different types of strategies that cities could consider employing to promote the development of housing. There's all of these different categories, and the whole intent of this is to provide cities a menu of options that they can look through and say, oh, we're going to do these strategies because these work really well in our context. For each strategy, I'm not going to talk a lot about this. There's some kind of specific requirements. You have to describe the strategy, you have to kind of set a timeline for adoption and implementation, and then you have to think through kind of the expected magnitude of impact. So that way, you're not just implementing these small, relatively meaningless strategies and saying, well, we've met our housing need. And so really, this kind of gets cities thinking about, is this actually addressing the totality of our housing need? Is it addressing all of these issues of, say, equity and considerations on that front? And then finally, there's this piece on fair and equitable housing outcomes. In our housing planning landscape today, cities have not traditionally thought or meaningfully incorporated equity into their housing needs analysis. Some cities that are on the forefront have done this, but it's really an optional venture. And so the whole point of this section is to get cities to think through how their strategies are affecting equitable outcomes in terms of housing. And we have these different categories that we've identified in relation to, location and transportation, fair housing, housing choice, the ability to live where you want to live, housing for people who are experiencing homelessness, opportunities for home ownership and affordable rental opportunities, and then of course housing stability, gentrification and displacement, things like that. So all of these cities have to reflect through how their strategies are affecting each one of these components. All right, and so to move into kind of the administration side, so that's the whole structure of the housing production strategy. On the reporting and review side, so of course they submit their housing production strategy when they first adopt it, and we review it to make sure it's in compliance. But they also have these kind of continuing obligations to report things. They have to report, for one, the number of units that they produce each year. This is under House Bill 4006, and it's kind of intended to keep track of how many units are actually being built on the ground year after year after year. And then finally, there's this kind of mid-cycle report on the housing production strategy, which is really intended to think through how is progress on implementation going for these housing production strategies? Have you been implementing strategies? What challenges have you been facing? And how are you achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes? And then finally, there's this question, what do we do about people who don't want to play ball? And so the bill in House Bill 2003 provides us a lot of tools to start thinking through enforcement essentially, kind of ramping up our ability to kind of coerce jurisdictions to comply with the requirements of this bill. And there's all of these tools that are outlined in the bill that LCDC or the Land Conservation and Development Commission can use in issues of noncompliance. And the way we decided to structure this was to have this kind of tier of enforcement system that really starts with trying to, nudge jurisdictions towards compliance through working together, and then moving into the more hardball measures. So, enhanced review, financial enforcement, and then ultimately an enforcement order, which is kind of this legal order from LCDC to comply with the statute. And there's two tracks that we've identified as needing enforcement. One is, are you actually adopting a housing needs analysis and a housing production strategy on the schedule that you're required to meet? So are you actually participating in the system at all? And then the second track, when you have a housing production strategy, you're required to implement the various strategies that you've identified. And so what do we do in instances where cities, they might have identified strategies, but they're not really doing anything to implement those strategies? So there's these kind of two tracks of enforcement. And really that's kind of the core or high level overview of what a housing production strategy, what goes into the housing production strategy. Of course, these two bills are incredible. They're really changing the housing landscape in our state today. But, one thing that has kind of come through, and I understand is going to be a topic for discussion today, is these kind of continuing challenges and considerations that we have when we think about providing housing need for the state at large. And, I've been engaged in a lot of conversations, and I've just wanted to share some of the things that I've been hearing in kind of talking through these with just a variety of folks from around the state. One of the biggest concerns that we have, or one of the biggest kind of considerations that we have for anything that we're doing, is how are we actually achieving kind of equitable outcomes, not just, within cities, but between cities and statewide, because this is something that has traditionally not really been addressed in our housing planning landscape. The second piece is, I've been throwing out a lot of pretty big numbers today, 580,000 units over the next 20 years. And one of the biggest topics that comes up is, we don't have the resources to do this, right? When it comes to local governments, it's like, we don't have the infrastructure to support this. We don't have the planning capacity to be able to permit all of these things and plan for these things. And so one of the big things that we've been hearing about is this need to build capacity, not just at the local government level for planning, but also for actual housing developers, right? Ensuring that infrastructure is in place to accommodate housing development, ensuring that tools for affordable housing are readily available for folks who are building that type of thing, and ensuring that there's enough resources to build affordable housing, right? And then additionally, there's these kind of other pieces that are related to. One is accountability. How do we ensure that, everybody's kind of doing their due diligence in terms of meaningfully responding to housing production and ensuring that housing is getting built, while also recognizing the limitations for each. For example, we know that local jurisdictions, they have a lot of responsibilities in terms of how they affect the housing policy landscape in terms of, whether housing actually gets built or not. But it's also important to recognize that they're one player of many, right? There's all of these market factors that go in, there's state policy that goes into, and federal policy that goes into the development of housing and whether housing gets built on the ground. And so really, one of the biggest considerations is how do we structure accountability to consider both of those factors. And then finally, one of the big things that's come out of this rulemaking or just these conversations is House Bill 2001 and 2003 only go so far in terms of addressing housing. We've identified a lot of other policies at the statewide level that really get at affecting housing. I think one of the biggest ones is condominiums and land divisions that get at, are these different housing types actually going to be built? What are the policies that actually affect housing development on the ground? And how can we address those in the future? So those are some of the key things that I've been hearing. And, I think I would love to hear from the other kind of panelists today to kind of think through some of these other issues. And with that, that's kind of my presentation. Hopefully I've kept it within time. And I think, at this point, I'm ready to kind of dive into discussion, answer questions, things like that.
Awesome. Wow, that was incredible. I think Kyle should be the time that we send out a quiz to everyone who just listened to all that and make sure that they've got it all down perfectly. So I think we're going to collect questions throughout, and feel free to use the chat functionality if you'd like to. But I know that you're the turkey in our Thanksgiving dinner here, Sean, but we've got a lot of stuff that adds the context, and some of our other panelists that I want to get to too, that are the stuffing and the gravy and all of that fun stuff. So without further ado, why don't we dive into that? And I'm going to introduce a few of our other esteemed colleagues who have joined us. In various capacities, they serve around the cities, large and small, around our state. And while we won't cover the entire state today in terms of geography, what you will hear is relevant to the ongoing efforts to comply with the legislation Sean just briefed us on in those cities statewide. So my first guest is Betsy Schultz. She's the owner of PNW Strategies, a government affairs and political consulting firm. Many of you know her. Betsy works with many issues and candidates across the party lines, ensuring quality outcomes for her clients and community. She serves as the Government Affairs Director for the Lane County Realtors Associations and is a current member of the Lane County Planning Commission. Betsy, thank you for joining us today. All right, next is a familiar face to many of you. It's our own Jeremy Rogers, who is the Director of Legal Affairs and Public Policy for the Oregon Realtors, and served as a member of the Department of Land Conservation and Development's Middle Housing Model Code Task Force. He's a graduate of University of Puget Sound and Lewis and Clark Law School. So Jeremy, thanks for joining us. If you can't go to George Fox, Puget Sound and Lewis and Clark are fine. So that's great. Justin Livingston. Justin Livingston is a realtor and the managing principal broker, many of you know, in the Bend area of Fathom Realty. He has served the city of Bend as a city councilor since 2017, after serving 2 years on the city's Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. He is the current chair of the Bend Metropolitan Planning Organization and Bend Urban Renewal Agency. A busy guy. Justin, thanks for joining us. And finally, I've got two more. I have Derek Tokos, has been the Community Development Director at the City of Newport since 2009, serving that city's population of just over 10,000 Oregonians. He's a graduate of University of Colorado Denver's Master's Program in Urban and Regional Planning. Thank you, Derek, for joining us. And finally, Skylar Warren is a senior planner in Community Development Department at the City of Tigard, serving their population of nearly 60,000 people. He is a graduate of University of Oregon's Master Community Program and Regional Planning, and he created the city's first affordable housing plan. And his work is focused on long-range planning and capital projects within Tigard city limits. So thank you all for joining me today, and feel free to unmute and we'll kind of get into it. So Jeremy, why don't you start? You're the probably most familiar face for our members. I'm hoping you can follow up on the presentation we just heard by speaking a little bit to the opportunity the local implementation of these bills presents to our realtors statewide, and how can they get involved in their local communities and assist with the process of planning for future housing needs?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And first off, I just wanted to say thanks to Sean and the department for the excellent work that they did leading the process of developing the rules. It was a difficult, these are major changes in Oregon law, and it was a lot of different opinions of stakeholders on the groups, and they did a very, very good job, and it was an honor to serve on that. I think that these bills are just critical pieces of the future for Oregon to be able to meet the housing needs that we have. And you just heard about the 583,000 units. I mean, that is astonishing. I think it's 30,000 units a year. Over 20 years, that's twice what we're building now. And so in order to actually execute on that, now the conversation is going to shift down to the local level, because these rules are going to be in place, and we have to figure out how to help our cities meet those goals. Make sure that they're implementing the House Bill 2001 rules in a way that allows for these middle housing types to flourish in their community, and really taking seriously the opportunity around these housing needs analysis and housing production strategies, because that's really the tool that's going to allow us to show how we're going to get to those 583,000 units. And so at this point, I think it's really critical for realtors to reach out to their GADs, reach out to their local associations, and figure out how they can be involved and stay on top of these issues as they're now going to become before the local city councils. If you don't have a GAD and you're not sure how to stay on top of this, reach out to the OAR staff and team, and we'll help you figure that out. But this is not something where we can say, check the box, bill passed, rules written. It really is now about implementation at the local level. And so I think this is all about realtors rolling up their sleeves and getting involved alongside the home builders and other advocates who want to see more housing get built at the local level.
Awesome, Jeremy. Yeah, it's so needed. It's an amazing number, like you said, of what we need, and hopefully this helps get us there. So I've got a question for all of our panelists, and what I'm going to ask that you do, if you'd like to speak, just raise your actual hand and I'll call on you, just so we're not talking over each other. But how do you see the mandate in House Bill 2001 that cities must allow Oregonians to build duplexes and other types of missing middle housing in areas zoned for single family dwellings affecting your community? Does anyone want to speak to that? Okay, Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and be part of this conversation. It's an important one. The city of Bend has long been, one of the fastest growing cities, mid-sized cities in the country. And so we were actually at the forefront of a lot of this. And so a lot of these changes really, we have to make some changes, but we've already had implemented a lot of them. And a lot of House Bill 2001 was actually built on what Bend had already been doing. We were already doing duplexes and triplexes in our standard density or standard residential zones. And so we had cottage clusters and ADUs, and we were doing a lot of these things. And so it's really not as big of an issue for us. We have had to make some changes. But it really it's a way to get units on the ground, and that, doing housing needs analysis are very important. The one that we did in 2015 showed that we had a 5,000 unit deficit for people that were 80% of area median income and below. So this is a very important conversation and very key. And I think the association, our local association, Central Oregon Association of Realtors, was really key in getting a lot of those policies put into place, really before the state mandated it. I'm always a big fan of local control. And so however, realtors and everybody can get engaged is very important.
Awesome, Justin. Betsy, Skylar, Derek, any of you like to approach that question?
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely a little too early for us down in Lane County, although we have the whole gamut. We have Cottage Grove, who implemented the bill in its entirety January of this year. And then we have Eugene that's still doing a lot of soul searching to figure out, do they really have to, and how are they going to do it? But it's forcing a much needed conversation here in Lane County. And it's kind of shifted the conversation from do we want to do this to how are we going to, which I think is a good step in the right direction.
Awesome. Yeah, great point. And I understand it's being adopted differently at different locales. Skylar, you're muted, but why don't you speak to this?
Yeah, so like Bend, City of Tigard implemented a missing middle housing reform legalization in 2018, so predating HB 2001. And, so the impact the bill is going to have is small, but the impact that missing middle housing is going to have on the community is going to be big. You heard those astonishing numbers. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of the change that we're going to see in terms of housing production is going to be slow in terms of infill and redevelopment. And maybe that offers some comfort to some folks who might be a little squeamish about what this is going to mean for the future of neighborhoods. But it also, it means that we're not necessarily going to see, we've had the legalization in place, 2 years now. We're seeing very small amounts of adoption for infill. Where we do see a lot of opportunity is in the greenfield development. So right now we're doing concept planning for an urban reserve area, and it's completely turned the way that we do planning for those urban reserves out on the edge of the urban growth boundary on its head. Because we are really looking at a complete inclusion of every single housing type across the board in those areas. And I think it is going to result in a more equitable neighborhood, and one that has opportunity for some of your clients who might be a younger family or a senior who maybe has lower income, but still has a stable income and could afford to purchase a home. But there's just not homes out there being built that are the right size and price point for them. And so I think it is going to show some market change across communities, Tigard and elsewhere, in the way that we do that greenfield development.
Interesting. Perfect. Derek, what is Newport doing in this area?
Well, like a number of the other panelists, the impact of House Bill 2001 is going to be pretty limited out here in Newport. And that's in large part due to the fact that we've already allowed duplexes in most of our residential zones as it stands. And, the issues, I think, you're going to see some duplex development, incrementally over time, if it meets the needs of the particular property owner who's looking to do that work. I think one of the challenges we find anytime you're looking at infill work here, and that's a lot of what we do get in Newport because of the challenges we have with terrain and infrastructure costs and things of that nature, is people truly understanding what it takes to convert, say, a single family home into a duplex or accessory dwelling unit. You have firewall requirements and things like that under building safety codes that people need to get their arms wrapped around in terms of what the actual cost is and fully understand that when they're walking into a project. And so, we have those conversations regularly with folks now, and we expect to continue to have those discussions both with realtors and buyers and sellers, frankly.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about the partner bill, House Bill 2003. And Skylar, why don't we go to you first on this one? How's your community preparing to comply with the requirement to regularly study future housing needs as well as develop strategies to make sure that the housing is produced?
So this is another one where we sort of got ahead of the bill. And we're actually in the process of doing an updated housing needs analysis right now. So we will not quite be on the same clock. Our clock is going to be reset here in the next year. So that housing production strategy piece won't necessarily come into play for us for, another half dozen years. But that said, we did receive under House Bill 4006, another 2018 bill that was looking at, housing need across the state. We received a grant to do a housing implementation study, and we used that money to do an affordable housing plan, the city's first affordable housing plan. And with that, we worked with experts from across multiple fields, including realtors, to assess what we needed in place policy-wise to really encourage more affordable housing, and that could run from regulated affordable housing all the way up to market, market provided affordable housing, just lower cost units. And we came up with a series of strategies, around 12 of them, 12 to 16 of them. Of those, we've already implemented 5. So STC exemptions for accessory dwelling units, a construction excise tax to fund affordable housing, some others. So we're working quickly to go to those production strategies. And of course, we'll update that as required under the state law.
Gotcha. Let me go to Jeremy and then to Betsy. Jeremy, from a holistic standpoint across the state, how are you seeing this 2003 compliance taking place?
Yeah, well, I think that the fact that the bill passed and even just the work that's already been done that Sean showed us on the regional housing needs analysis and painting a picture of what the need is and doing so by region and sort of by type and by income level. And that's pretty revolutionary for our housing and land use planning. So I think that this is just a huge step forward. And then, the question then really becomes, okay, how do we, down at the local level, get this into place and make sure that these housing production strategies aren't just an exercise, but really are, the plan and the path forward. And I think on the call today, you have some examples of some cities who really take that to heart and have been doing that, before this bill even passed. Of course, there's some other cities out there that, are more reluctant to move forward on some of these bills. And so I think, that's where, as I mentioned before, everyone getting involved and sort of from our team getting involved locally and using this opportunity of the housing production strategy as sort of the engagement point to engage with your local government. I mean, there's now a framework that needs to be implemented to document what the needs are and to come up with policy changes to meet those needs. And so that's just a perfect vehicle for advocates like the Realtors and Betsy and others at the local level to get involved and really help their cities make it happen.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeremy. Betsy, let's talk about Lane County. What are you seeing?
Yeah, thank you, Drew. I just want to say all of us down in Lane County know we're not as cool as the folks up in Tigard and getting their act together as soon as possible. So we talk about that quite a bit. Yeah, I think it's certainly a back burner issue for us at this point. I think there's kind of the collective, angst of we got to get through implementation of 2001 first. But I think it's something that certainly the city planners are very much aware of. And in Springfield, I was just chatting with their city planner, and it's something that he's really excited about delving into and knowing that it's going to be very impactful. We just kind of have to get through a few things first. But I think it's certainly where the conversation will get even more real, and as folks see how behind we actually are.
Interesting. Okay. Let's move to the next question. Let me start with Justin, because Justin, amongst your many hats, you are also a Realtor by trade. So how important do you think it is for Realtors to be involved in this process? And why don't you speak to how they can become involved? And are you able to share any upcoming opportunities to get involved in these discussions in local communities for Realtors?
And no, I think it's very important for Realtors to be involved. I will caution you that you get too involved and sometimes you end up running for elected office. Whether it's you have government affairs committees on your local associations or even at the statewide level. I was chair of that locally for a couple of years. Obviously, I ended up running for office. The chair after me was Representative Zika. So be careful what you wish for. But I think there's lots of ways to get involved. Not only on the association level, but also with the local jurisdictions. Right now, actually, the city of Bend has a position open we're actually recruiting for somebody for the planning commission. And there's lots of different ways, so one of the ways that, to really influence things is there's standing committees, there's planning commission, there's affordable housing committee. Our affordable housing committee since 2006 actually has a dedicated seat. We have multiple dedicated seats, but one of them is for an appointee from the association. So the association automatically gets to appoint somebody. And I filled that role for the association for a couple of years, and it's really valuable to get into this. Not only it's a great learning experience and you can serve your clients, but also you have an opportunity to really influence how your cities look like, look and grow in the future. And I think, I think one of the misconceptions that I hear a lot is like, well, higher housing prices are always good for you for business. Well, they're not. When you have to spend a lot of time, finding somebody. I've got a client that's at 800 and I can't find him a house. And so, having affordable housing is absolutely good for business. And you have a wide range of people that, can live in your city, work in your city. It's overall good for the community.
Yeah. So Derek, in the city of Newport, which is one of my favorite cities in Oregon, how can realtors get involved out there?
No, absolutely. One of those things is engage with us, and a large part of our local real estate community does that. They pose questions to me and other members of our staff. They bring, get their clients oriented to speaking with planning office. I think it's important for our local real estate community to engage with us so they can educate themselves in terms of how the city is implementing these various requirements. I would echo Mr. Livingston's comments about getting engaged on committees when they have time. And I know everybody's very busy in this, but there are opportunities to engage on committees as well. Realtors are really, they're a key for both buyers and sellers. They're relied upon to convey accurate information so that people going through a real estate transaction feel comfortable that they know everything that they need to know. And, some of the best realtors I've run into, they always beat the bush to make sure that they fully understand that everything that's in play so that they get the information to their clients. And so I say, just continue to engage, reach out. It's always good to communicate, make sure everything is known, up front, and there are no surprises.
Awesome. Yeah, realtors who work 7 days a week, I don't know how they find the time to volunteer, but so many of them do. Justin, I don't know how you sleep, my friend, but good for you. Well, let me ask some individual questions now, and let me start with Betsy. So Betsy, let's talk about how municipalities within your jurisdiction planning to implement the state's legislation. Are there any exciting coalitions, ideas, or momentum building there? You talked about different paces amongst some different Lane County areas.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got the whole gamut from, like I said, Cottage Grove having already implemented, and they are really passionate about moving forward even to, and this is something that Sean mentioned, dealing with the parking issue, where they're wanting to move toward just requiring one space of parking per one unit of development, just across the board, no matter what. So we'll see how that conversation goes. Springfield had started completely redoing their development code, and we're going to get ahead of House Bill 2001. And then when the new rules came out, they're like, well, we better scale this back, make sure we get it right. So they're still grappling with that, wanting to be creative, but making sure that they're getting everything in a row. And then again, yes, Eugene, still trying to figure out what do we want to do, how do we want to do this. So I think they will be squeaking in under the wire to get that implementation done. But you mentioned coalitions, and yes, so the realtors have been part of creating what is now just last week became its real own nonprofit, Better Housing Together, which is a coalition of over 50 community partners ranging from Food for Lane County, NAACP, developers, realtors, architects, United Way, HIV Alliance, all folks coming together, deciding that we may not agree on everything, but we can agree on advocating for housing affordability, diversity, and supply. And that, we can't all be in one place at one time. And so being able to get our partners into those rooms to have meetings with city councilors. So it's not just the realtors saying we need more units, but it's Food for Lane County saying we actually need more units. So that has been huge and has certainly shifted and helped move the conversation from just we need to push out the urban growth boundary to how can we be creative about this in an equitable way, which is position the realtors in a really, really great place to have those conversations.
Awesome. It's exciting to see them be a part of that. Skylar, let me pivot to you, my friend. So the Community Development Director in Tigard was featured at the Oregon Leadership Summit last December, and he spoke to the fact that Tigard was already on track to be compliant with House Bill 2001 at that time. And you kind of mentioned that. Can you speak to how the city was so ahead of the game? What did the effort to update the city's development code look like, and how were the city council and planning commission involved in this first effort?
Yeah, well, first, I appreciate Betsy's comment that we're cool. We think we're cool, but that's not how we got ahead of the game. We just it was the right time and the right place. I think for us, we were already considering housing policy change with Senate Bill 1051, which was the bill that legalized ADUs on all lots, and so using that as our starting point, we just started to say, what are the next steps? Like, if we're going to game plan out what a neighborhood looks like at build out with an additional ADU, what does a neighborhood look like maybe with 4 small ADU like units on a lot? And we started to, kind of piece those things together. And what we found was that not a huge difference in the way a neighborhood looks or feels. And that was backed up with the, what we were hearing back from the community. I'll also say that we had a council that was very interested in housing reform. And at that time, Tom Anderson, who is one of our counselors, he's a professional realtor, understands housing need out there. They were very interested in moving the conversation forward on market and regulated affordable housing options. They saw the need in the community based on the housing emergency that we've been seeing really since the mortgage crisis in 2008. We've kind of steadily ramped up to a worsening crisis every year since. So that's, it was just right time, right place for us. Also right staff, right director. Luck and perseverance and drive, I think, is how we got there.
Well, there you go. Sometimes better to be lucky than good. So, and you're good too. Trust me, I get it. So let's pivot over. One thing I read is that razor sales are at their all-time low, and I see that Skylar, Justin, Jeremy, and I are all proof of that. Derek is staying clean cut, which I appreciate. But let's go to Jeremy because Jeremy, you participated on the Middle Housing Model Code Technical Advisory Committee over the past year. What are you seeing come out of that? Do you think the legislature will have to adjust the legislation at all in 2021?
Well, so the rules aren't quite finished yet. The commission took them up last Thursday, Friday at their meeting and adopted most of them, but there are still a few pieces that they are sending back to the Rules Advisory Committee and the Technical Advisory Committee to work on. So I'll just touch a little bit on what some of those are and what some of the controversial pieces are. But I also just want to mention again the really talented, skillful work that the staff did in herding a lot of cats and putting this together. And overall, I think they're in pretty good shape. A couple of the things that were more controversial and that I think something that, depending on how they play out, the legislature could take a look at. There was a lot of discussion around alternative ways for cities to comply. This is something that cities kind of came in through the League of Cities and some other particular cities that were on the Rules Advisory Committee and said, hey, we need more flexibility in these minimum standards. And so, there's some alternative ways for compliance that are in there where a city wouldn't need to necessarily meet all of the minimum standards for, around development and design standards. For example, a city could have stricter development and design standards if they were able to demonstrate that they allowed certain middle housing types on a certain percentage of lots, or that they were hitting a certain production target around middle housing, although that's pretty low in the rules currently. And so I think these alternative approaches to complying that are more performance-based is something that I'm not sure if it was envisioned by the legislature or not. It was something that kind of came up as a flexibility tool. And so depending on how those play out, I think that's something the legislature could revisit just to make sure that they're actually achieving the goals that were intended by having, minimum standards. There was a lot of controversy around how to deal with master plan communities. So that's another area where I could potentially see the legislature revisiting. And then, just some technical issues. There was a lot of work that went on economic analysis to determine like, okay, how many, what does it actually take to build a triplex or a fourplex from a home builder's perspective? And are these rules we're putting together going to actually allow for those to be built? And, there's a relatively narrow set of circumstances where the economics actually make sense for building these units. And so I think just on some of the technical development and design standards that are in the minimum compliance standards, do they actually allow for those units to be built in the marketplace? Will they actually get there? And so I could see some tweaking of those down the road if we didn't get those quite right. But as I said, overall, I think the staff and the committees did a really good job of trying to balance out the needs. And I think there'll be a few additional improvements at the next rules committee, and these will be finalized. And I don't expect a lot of changes right away. More if once they play out in the market and if they're not meeting their objectives.
Yeah.
Well, let me pivot to our clean-shaven friend, which is interesting. I think you're the only clean-shaven person I've seen in a while at Newport, Derek, but good for you. And Kyle, if you wouldn't mind collecting some questions so we can do that. I know we got about 15 minutes left, and if there's anything in the Q&A that we can address after I ask Derek this question, and including if anyone has any questions for Sean, who gave the presentation at the beginning, I think he's been kind enough to stick with us. But the city of Newport, Derek, as of 2018, I think population was just over 10,000. So unless the population has fallen since then, it would make Newport one of the smallest cities subject to the requirement of House Bill 2001. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So, I mean, that being the case, what challenges do you and your team face in complying with the legislation, and how has your volunteer leadership, the council, the planning commission, reacted to the requirement of those bills?
Sure. With respect to House Bill 2001, we're well on our way to adjusting our code to address the duplex requirements. And so we're not too concerned about that. And our planning commission and council have been quite receptive to those changes. I think the bigger challenge for us is going to be House Bill 2003. There's quite a bit more analysis that's required with the housing needs assessment. And I'm not really confident that the state really had good representation from smaller jurisdictions when those rules were pulled together. That said, we will address those as we have, housing needs assessment requirements in the past. We've done quite a bit in terms of implementing development incentives. We've had quite a bit of success with that over recent years. I mean, we just had a 110-unit multifamily affordable housing project wrapped up, and it located in Newport in large part because of a property tax incentive that we put in place. That's for that project, $1.6 million over 10 years. I can go down a list, I won't right now, of a number of other measures we've implemented with some success, others not so much. That's what happens when you try different tools to incentivize development. That said, House Bill 2003, it gets into, what are we doing to influence gentrification? How are we addressing homelessness? And homelessness for our policymakers is a big issue, but they also recognize as a city, we have a limited ability to influence that. The whole social safety net program is really more on the county side than the city side. So that does create some challenges for us to respond to that kind of thing. For the housing need analysis and housing production strategies, we will be hiring some outside assistance to help. We have limited staff, and hopefully there will be some state funding available so that we're not having to bear that full cost. So that's kind of where we're at.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. It's obviously different wherever you go. And it's great to hear the perspective from all of you, from Bend to Tigard to Lane County to Newport, and to Sean and Jeremy, looking at that statewide perspective. So Kyle, from our esteemed audience, do we have any questions that maybe this panel could address?
We have a couple, so I would invite anybody that does have questions to shoot them to me in the chat. I think you also have the ability to shoot questions to anybody that is a co-host, which is all of our panelists. So if anybody did that, if they could redirect those to me, that would be great. But to our panelists, if you happen to have received any individual questions in the chat to you directly, let me know. A question was received from Marianne. And I think she works along the coast, and so this might be a question for Mr. Tokos. How are we going to work on safe ingress and egress issues on the coast as we add additional housing in areas where there is limited access to Highway 0. I think she might have meant Highway 1.
Yes, Highway 101. It's always a challenge in our community, particularly for locals to be able to access the state highway system. So much flow through traffic that, you know, the queuing for people trying to get on and off the highway is it's a challenge. One of the issues that we're doing right now is updating our transportation system plan. And we also, in 2015, created an urban renewal district along our highway corridors, in part to fund some much needed upgrades along the highway system, jointly, ideally, with the Oregon Department of Transportation. Get some additional signals in there, particularly, you know, as we see development in our area, you know, that feeds into the highway system. So if we can get some additional signals in there, it creates additional gaps, people get on and off the system. So funding infrastructure improvements is always a challenge, but, you know, as a local government, we're really taking it upon ourselves to self-generate some funds, given the tools we have like urban renewal, so that we can make strategic investments in the system.
Got it. Awesome. Well, I see a question in the chat here directly to me, but it talks about an R2 zoning. For more homes, it's often a challenge to fight the city for the number of parking required. Seems to be a big hump to overcome. Any ideas as to how that might be addressed going forward? Anyone can take that one. And then before someone answers, I see Randy and Riley with their hands raised. We may try to bring you on to ask your question, so be ready there. But on the R2 zoning parking, Skylar, take it away.
So I will say that largely we have tried to get out of the business of regulating off-street parking because we recognize that by requiring off-street parking, we're actually artificially inflating the costs of construction, and we're planning places for cars rather than places for people. And we also understand that you all work in the open marketplace. The market is going to provide off-street parking with or without regulation. There's no doubt about that. And so in those instances where opportunity and you know, the built form align, that no off-street parking requirements or lower off-street parking requirements make sense, then, you know, the developer is going to take advantage of that if possible. So our approach has been to just sort of increasingly step away from parking. We've actually offered a couple of off-street parking reductions through on-street parking credits, because, you know, the reality is most driveway aprons are about, you know, what, 20 or 15 feet wide. Parking space is about 20 feet long. So by the time, you know, you've put in a driveway apron, you've taken away an off-street or an on-street parking space anyway. So that's kind of the direction that we're headed in Tigard.
Got it. Yeah, that makes good sense. All right, Randy Shaw, I hope you're wearing pants because I'm going to spotlight your video here, my friend. So let's see what happens. There you are. Okay, you want to unmute and ask your question, Randy? You're muted at the moment.
All right. Yeah, I'm fully clothed, Drew, so we're good there.
Good.
So I don't really have a question. What I have is an observation that we're seeing in Klamath Falls, the city, and in the unincorporated portion of the county within the urban growth boundary. I think we have plenty of space. We have a high demand. Our problem is financing construction. So where does the money come from, and how do we get that money on the ground? And then the second problem is our labor pool. We don't have the tradespeople that are needed to even come close to meeting this demand. And, you know, it's a difficult thing to really deal with here because we've lost so many people from the early 2000s that left the community based on the housing market and the crash that took place that we're all familiar with. You know, there's some efforts ongoing here with the Klamath Basin home builders. And I think that's happening on a statewide basis a little bit also. My suggestion would be that we need to get the Home Builders Association involved in this discussion, because not just the zoning issues, but the supply is a real big problem. I don't know how it is in other markets, but in our market, that's probably the #1 problem is the supply. And how do we increase that supply, and how do we get it financed?
Well, why don't I we brought Sean back on camera, and I'm sure at the DLCD level, there's been conversations about that. Sean, can you speak to that? And then if anyone else wants to as well.
Oh yeah, I think this gets at, some of the biggest conversations that we've seen happening through rulemaking is there's so many pieces that are just untouched by House Bills 2001 and 2003. I think one of the biggest ones is financing and dealing with that, say, labor pool shortage. And I think it's clear, from our perspective, that there's going to need to be kind of a push for, policy that can, one, achieve more with less, so be able to kind of reduce costs that way, and then also facilitate that kind of supply and linking that ability to, say, finance additional projects, or assist the labor pool, or provide additional options to kind of say package more, say, efficient development packages, say through condominium reform, through changes to how we kind of plan for lots, that kind of thing. So that's kind of not lost on us, that fundamental interaction with the market. And through our rulemaking, we've tried to always have that kind of market sensitivity in the back of our minds. But at the same time, there's only so much that we can address through this rulemaking. So yeah, that's a great point. It's very salient.
Yeah, thank you, Randy, and thanks, Sean, for that answer. Anyone else want to speak to that?
Sure, I'll just jump in and just let Randy and everyone know that both through this rulemaking, we've been walking hand in hand with the home builders in terms of the comments we've been providing and trying to shape this. But also, to Sean's point, these bills only deal with so much. So we're working with the home builders on a statewide level on other policies as well. And I agree, a lot needs to be done to make it easier and more affordable to build things, including condominiums, but everything. I mean, and frankly, looking at what Tigard's done as an example and saying, okay, how can that be replicated in more places, and what sorts of policies at the local level can help, but what can we learn for state policy as well? I do want to make a plug at this point, because we're talking about home builders and financing and supply. The Oregon Housing Economics Summit will be January 14th, 9 to noon, second year. We do this event jointly with the bankers and the home builders, and we'll be talking about these very issues in preparation for the 2021 legislative session, in terms of what bills we'll be trying to work together with the home builders and the bankers on to get at some of these issues. So Randy, thanks for recognizing that these bills are not the solution to everybody's problem.
Good point, Jeremy, and thank you. And Derek, I saw that you had a quick comment on that, and then I'll bring Riley on with her comment or question.
Sure. I just want to echo, we share the same kind of challenges as Klamath Falls, being a rural community. And I think it really is that distinction. Rural areas struggle. We have limited labor pool, mobilization costs for construction crews coming in from the valley, just drives up the overall cost of construction. And it's hard to attract, construction companies from the valley, because our scale generally is much smaller. So, you're not looking at as good of a profit margin. So those are areas that really do need attention.
Interesting. Yeah, and I can see where that would be. And obviously it's a very needed thing, despite the size of your market. That's something that people need. So Riley, there you are. You had a question or comment. Thanks for being patient.
Sure, thanks. He, not her, but it's all right. I have a beard as well. I am also a city elected official. I'm one of the councilors here in Lincoln City. This is my second term now, and I've been the chairman of the budget committee. I've been on the planning commission, and I've been a realtor for 2 years. And Lincoln City is in a unique position. And we've tried, we've applied all the House Bill 2001 changes, I believe. We allow for cottage clusters. We allow for the fourplex, big homes. Some areas of, depending on zoning, can have the ADUs. We're trying to bring all that in. Something else we've done is we have 3 different blueprints at the planning office that people, if they've already been pre-approved, and so we're trying to lower those SDC charges, and really the entry levels to building. Understanding that, like Derek said, these builders are coming in from the valley, and it's costing, quite a bit per square foot. But we also purchased land at the north end of town, and so we're looking at ways and trying to develop that with to incorporate home buying, not just renting. And Lincoln City has a lot of apartments, and they've been building recently, but we're all still trying to bring about home ownership too. And so, you know, as council progresses and everything, you know, it's a long process, but, you know, I don't know how much more. I just was brought to this meeting. I don't know if there's a way for me to participate more or anything like that, but I'd be open and, you know, would like to, I don't know, participate any way I can.
Thank you, Riley. Appreciate that, and be careful what you wish for in Realtor land. We'll get you as involved as you want, and I'm sorry for mispronouncing you without having met you. Apologies, but thank you for speaking up. Anyone want to comment on what Riley said there?
I'll take that on. Yeah, I think, you know, having the the city, and one thing that we've done in Bend a lot is we really search for any city-owned property in order to build deed restricted affordable housing. And we've given away a fair amount of land, you know, to that. And in having a lot of these, you know, I think a lot of these things are great, but you also have to, it has to come along with other policies and incentives that come along with that. You know, we actually exempt our SDCs for deed restricted affordable housing. You know, there's density bonuses, there's height, you know, exemptions that you can go up higher if you're providing a percentage of affordable housing. So there's a lot of other incentives that can come along and implement, better implement. But at the same time, cities can also put in, you know, barriers, even though, you know, we're saying that you can go ahead and build these, you know, this type of product. But, you know, if you have really restricted floor area ratios or lot coverage, you know, or if you make it a type 2, you know, one of the things that we found is in our accessory dwelling units is that they were a type 2 land use permit. Well, as soon as we made it a type 1, you know, we reduced the cost by, I don't know, $2,500 to $3,000. And we got all of a sudden, you get a bunch of them. When you lower barriers or remove barriers, you get a lot more housing. And so, you know, that's really the approach that we've taken, is that all of the above, and just help the city get out of the way.
Wonderful. Well, I want to, yeah, Sean, real quickly.
Yeah, and if I could just add, you know, I think one thing I've learned too through all of this is how much cities are just putting everything towards the wall, towards, you know, really trying to build housing. And I think one of our fundamental roles at the state, especially now that we're transitioning from rulemaking, is building capacity, information sharing at that local level to kind of think through some of these housing market issues and think about those kind of barriers and challenges to housing implementations. It's very necessary to implement this at the local level. So I appreciate the efforts of Lincoln City and want to continue working with you folks to develop solutions.
Perfect. Well, it's obvious we have a lot of smart people working towards this, and we're so fortunate in Realtor land to be able to have these lines of communication through our staff, through all of you. So a big thank you to all of our panelists. Give them a virtual clap at home for their time, and thanks again for everyone joining us today. As your incoming Oregon Realtors president, I look forward to working with our team and our statewide community of Realtor advocates to empower our members to get involved in important local community conversations just like these. So as Realtors, we are about increasing access to more housing opportunities at every turn, and the legislation we discussed today is about making that happen. Now it's up to us to see that it lives up to its promise on the ground. That means you, Realtors, working with your local associations to pay attention to what is going on at city council meetings, getting involved in local decision-making processes across the state. Realtors can and should advocate for effective implementation of these new policies at every opportunity over the next few years. So please get involved. Please know that your local Realtor Association staff and the Oregon Realtors Government Affairs team, we're always here at your service. If you'd like to talk to someone about how you can get involved in advocating for Realtor issues in your local communities, let us know. Thank you very much and have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.